Hey there, Banditos. Welcome to the latest episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah. And as always, we're bringing you the best and brightest in the comic book world, and today is no exception. We have editor extraordinaire, the great Diana Schutz, joining us today. You may know Diana primarily as an editorial force for Dark Horse Comics, where she spent 25 years working with such luminaries as Frank Miller, Matt Wagner, Paul Chadwick, and P. Craig Russell. But we go all the way back, as we are wont to do, to the early days when she started in a Canadian comic book shop called, appropriately enough, the ComicShop. She then started a newsletter called the Telegraph Wire and contributed to various fanzines and conventions. And then after the shortest of stints at Marvel, she was on to Comico during that imprint's heyday, and of course on to Dark Horse after that. But let's not spoil all the fun in the intro. Let's get to it. This is Diana Schutz. Her name is Diana Schutz. Diana, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here.
We're happy to have you. We're going to start with the question we ask everybody. You've probably answered it before, but we start this way, so we're going to start it this way for you. And that is, how did you first discover comic books?
Oh man, I have a few different origin stories, I guess, but I don't know if you can see what's on the wall behind me. It's the original art to the cover of Lois Lane, number 62 or 42. I'm forgetting right now. But, a 12-cent Lois Lane comic from the early 60s. And in many ways, it was Mort Weisinger that hooked me into comics, lock, stock, and barrel. The Marvels, when I was 5 in 1960, and the Marvels were just a bit too sophisticated for me. Although I really dug the kind of apocalyptic horror stuff from Strange Tales and the other titles that would eventually become superhero titles. But the pre-superhero stuff, written by Stan, drawn by Jack or Steve Ditko, were really compelling to me as a kid, also really creepy. And when I was buying comics on my own, it was the sort of a kinder, gentler DC Superman family stuff that really spoke my 5-year-old language, I guess. So, and as to how I discovered comics or became aware of them, it's important to realize that in the early 60s, comics were everywhere. I didn't have to go to a special store or know about a special store where comics were sold. Any place I went, there were comics on a spin rack. The now obsolete mom and pop corner stores had comics. My great aunt and great uncle ran a Pop's chocolate shop place, soda counter, and they had a spin rack in the shop. Grocery stores, of course. So sure, everywhere that I went as a little kid, any commercial establishment seemed to have comics. So where did I find them specifically? God only knows. Everywhere.
That the collector sort of gene or attitude. Did you have that as a young kid? Did you happen to hang on to any of those early issues?
No, too bad. No, I did not. And eventually my mother, like so many other mothers of her era, trashed them. So yes, a fortune down fortune in the garbage. Um,
It's a story we've heard before.
yes, and and thank goodness for those mothers who did that, because that's what has made a collectible marketplace, right?
Mhm.
So the fact that they're not not so readily available. Um, I didn't begin collecting until I was older, until I was an adult. Um, and as a kid, I read them and tossed them somewhere in the basement, reread them from time to time. But no, I didn't have that early anal retention kind of. uh, yeah, that came later.
Some do, but many don't. I was sort of, some of my early stuff was sort of a victim of parental cleaning.
Really? Yeah.
Let's say. I read that you studied philosophy, and I did as well in higher
Oh,
education. And I
interesting.
was wondering if you've ever thought about this, because I've met a number of folks who have also studied philosophy in college that are also comic fans. Do
Huh.
you see any connection between that discipline and comic books at all?
um, well, for me, the connection. There are two things that immediately come to mind. The the stuff that I was reading in school, um, and I did a double major for my bachelor's degree, um, uh, creative writing and philosophy.
Mhm.
So I was, doing both things, and then I went on to grad school in philosophy, and especially once I was in grad school, the reading was at such a high level. Um, it was extremely intense. And one of my main areas of interest in philosophy actually was formal logic. So there you're reading high level mathematical theory, guys like Bertrand Russell, um, uh, Quine, Hintica, all these names from, we're going back 40 plus years
Yeah.
now. Um, and the work is really, really demanding. Um, so on the weekends, I switched, I was switching from, say, Immanuel Kant to Jack Kirby. And for one, I needed something lighter. That's not the right word.
Less
Something,
weighty.
yeah, something that just that I could enjoy. That's something that didn't require such enormous mental effort, I guess. Um, but by the same token, um, it, there were there were a lot of connections between what I was doing and, say, reading Silver Surfer. you know, uh, yeah, I don't know. What do you think about that? You must have. You were you were you were definitely reading comics at the same time. Yes.
Uh, yes. Well, actually, I think I got back into comics because I took a sort of a break at the latter years of high school into the early years of college,
Huh.
and
Yeah.
then I got back into comics sort of late in college and as I got out. Um, and I'm not sure. I think I was also studying maybe a different discipline, more philosophy of mind and like metaphysics and sort of those very
Oh,
larger, open-ended questions
who are
that I
who
think.
who are you reading mostly?
Oh, well, I mean, there was Descartes and I remember the foundational stuff,
Mm-hmm.
Descartes and Plato. Uh, and I'm struggling for the name that I'm about to. Well, one of the philosophy of mind guys' name was Searle,
Oh yeah,
who,
John Searle.
yeah, John
Yeah.
Searle,
Mm-hmm.
who I found very interesting. And then I'm forgetting somebody else that really I really liked, but I just can't produce the name right now. But I think maybe that's those kind of folks and just their thought experiments almost,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
shadows on the wall and
Mm-hmm.
Plato.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, somehow fed into some of the comics lore that was in there. But maybe that's a stretch. Maybe it just so happens, it's not causation, it's just, correlation that philosophy folks are also
Maybe.
comics folks. And maybe it's only us two anyway.
I mean, look, there's really a sense in which when you're studying philosophy, you're wrestling with some of the most fundamental questions there are about reality and what that even means, what other people mean, what other minds mean, um, and and I think that Jack Kirby certainly was on that wavelength. His lack of formal study notwithstanding, uh, I I think he was absolutely there. Um, his his vision for kind of the multiplicity of worlds outside ours seems to me to line up pretty squarely with what we were studying, Mike. So
I agree.
yeah.
And I'm just realizing that I took a course called Philosophy of Art,
Hmm.
and that
Mm-hmm.
certainly has, that part of philosophy certainly has bearing on
Yeah.
comics as well as, photography and writing and other things.
And
Um,
in fact, at Portland State University, where we're blessed here to have a bona fide comics studies program. Um, and comics is interdisciplinary. Lots of different fields of academic endeavor sort of feed into comics, and so there are a variety of courses uh, that our students, um, they have to take X number of courses from a list that we provide, and philosophy of art is on that list. Absolutely.
you got into the comic book industry. Your entree was through the sort of the retail arm, through the direct market, and working for the aforementioned comic shop, right?
Yeah.
What did that experience, and I know you went on to, I think, work at various different outfits. What did that teach you about the business of comics and comics in general?
Everything. I was really lucky. I was in at that point. I was in my. I transferred from an uncompleted master's program in philosophy to a PhD program, which in retrospect was a huge mistake. I was too young. I was 23 years old, and all I had done my entire life was school, and the stuff, as you know, was so high level, um, especially with my fellow PhD students who were miles ahead of me. It felt like, So I really I was feeling less and less in my element there, and had discovered the comic shop a few years earlier, and had gotten to know the owners pretty well. I was one of very few female customers, like maybe there were two of us, um, and in 1978 they offered me a job, and so I dropped out of grad school, and really it then began my education in comics. So yeah, I switched from philosophy at that point to comics and learned. And those two guys, Ken Witcher and the late Ron Norton, both of them 5 years older than me, and they had been comics fans, sort of from the ground up, and they were just without, like, you took a break from comics for a little while. I took a break from comics, that same sort of high school era where I was discovering boys and partying. And so, but Ron and Ken were patient. They were thrilled, I think, that one of their customers, it was a woman and was avidly interested in comics. And through them, I learned about the business, yes, but also about the art form. They were always telling me to, here, try reading this. They introduced me to Barry Windsor Smith's Conan, for instance, to Barry Windsor Smith. Um, um, that first X-Men that Christopher wrote, the annual, anyway, it was an X-Men annual that premiered the new X-Men that he did with John Byrne. So they handed me that. Try this. I think you'll like it. They handed me the first couple of issues of Frank's Daredevil, and the first issue of Cerebus. And being Canadian, of course, I immediately picked up on that. And it was a really political time for comics too. We're now in 1978, and the notion of creators' rights was just starting to come into, kind of hitting the waves, and creators were beginning to demand royalties, copyright ownership, and neither Marvel nor DC were prepared to give that to them. And so people like Dave Sim went and started their own company, their own self-publishing company. And this was also the advent of the independent publishers. In 1977, Dean Mullaney formed Eclipse Comics. Gary Groth and Kim Thompson and Mike Catron, I think it was the year before, in 1976, had started the Comics Journal. They didn't really begin publishing comics in a serious way until 1982 with Love and Rockets. But there were a few things that they had published before Love and Rockets. And so companies were coming into being, offering a viable alternative to Marvel and DC. It was a massively exciting era to be learning about comics. Things were changing. And so, yeah, it was, I'm a perennial student, I guess. And through Ron and Ken, I began learning so much, the history of the industry, the movers, the artistic movers and shakers, the political movers and shakers, the undergrounds. I'd never seen an underground comic until then, So really, it was a fantastic education.
You were sponging it all up
I was.
there. And how did the Telegraph Wire sort of fit into this evolution, and what kind of doors did that open for you?
In 1981, I moved out of Vancouver, BC, moved back home to Montreal for a little bit, and basically found myself at loose ends for the fall. I had been planning to go back to school to work. There was a new program, speaking of philosophy, that was being offered at Montclair State College in Upper Montclair, New Jersey, and they were training students, giving towards an education degree, but training them to teach philosophy in elementary school. So, imagine that. This was, a pretty revolutionary concept. I was fascinated by it, but what I had thought would be a one-year program wound up being a 2-year program for me for some reason. So I decided not to do that. I wasn't prepared to go back to school for that long. And I was at loose ends, and I wrote to Bud Plant, who had his distributorship at that time, comics distributorship. He was in Northern California in Grass Valley. And he was co-owner of the Comics and Comics chain of stores in Northern California. At that time, there were 6 Comics and Comics stores, 2 in the Bay Area, 1 in the South Bay. I forget where the rest were. Anyway, all in Northern California. And I just wrote to Bud and said, hey, I've worked in comics for 3 years. I know how to bag and tag. I even know how to appraise and price old comics. I know how to buy collections. I had been doing all that work for 3 years. Bud contacted his partner, the late John Barrett, who managed, basically oversaw all 6 stores, but worked out of their flagship Berkeley, California store. And I got a phone call and I got hired. So I drove my car from Montreal to Berkeley and started working at Comics and Comics. And very quickly, this was 1981, comics retail was really, we'd seen the direct market come into being in the 70s, but by the 80s, it was really solidifying. Retailers were organizing. Stores were publishing newsletters. And I decided that I would publish a newsletter for Comics and Comics for all 6 stores. And that newsletter began as a, 2 or 3 page Xeroxed, just a stapled Xerox thing. And in about a year's time, it morphed into into a real, like a 32-page, sometimes 48-page bi-monthly magazine, which I edited. I had a lot of help there too. Tom Orzechowski, letterer, great letterer of the X-Men and also Spawn. I think he's still lettering Spawn. Tom lived in San Francisco, but I met him one day in the Berkeley shop. We became friends, and he taught me everything about old school paste up design, and where you type everything out fastidiously, painstakingly, and then you glue it onto boards. And anyway, so I learned about design and paste up, and of course I was writing most of what went into this 32-page magazine, whose structure was loosely based on the journal, in that there would be a headline interview every issue, usually connected with whoever was going to be signing, doing an autograph party at Comics and Comics. So we would promote their work, they would sign in the shop, I would have a magazine ready to give out that contained their cover, which they graciously donated. Sometimes they donated the art to me, and I would interview many people, some of them for the very first time. I interviewed Scott McCloud in 1983 or 1984, and it was his first interview ever. Ditto Jim Valentino, one of the founding fathers of Image Comics, also a very close friend. But Jimmy at that time was just beginning Normal Man, which was going to be published by Aardvark Vanaheim. So I interviewed, I did Jimmy's first interview, interviewed the Hernandez brothers, Sergio Aragonés, I interviewed my brother-in-law, Matt Wagner, though he was not then my brother-in-law.
Not yet your brother-in-law.
No.
I mean, what an amazing experience. I mean, on top of already, being sort of swimming in the comic book waters by working at the shops. So how did that then? So you were doing this this magazine, this I guess it would be a fanzine or publication, and I think you worked at several others as well, or contributed to several others. How did it all lead to sort of the infamous 4 days of Marveldom?
Well, the great thing about Comics and Comics and working in comics in the US versus having worked in comics in Canada, like the flagship Berkeley Comics and Comics shop orchestrated signings, creator signings, really every other month at least. So I met countless people, and we were in the Bay Area, so the underground, many of the old underground guys were still there, guys and girls. Trina Robbins was there. Trina took me under her wing for a while, and also taught me. Lee Mars was there, Mike Friedrich, just so many people. And when there were conventions in Oakland usually, or in San Francisco, whoever the guests would happen to be, often did signings at the store as well. when Jack Kirby, when the first issue of Captain Victory was published through Pacific, Jack did a weekend of signings at the various Comics and Comics locations. And I volunteered, of course, I volunteered to host Jack and Roz around town. So, you know, I had driven a little Volkswagen Beetle from Montreal to Berkeley, so that was the car I had. And driving Jack and Roz to the various shops for Jack to do signings meant, of course, because Jack was such a gentleman, I was driving. So Roz was in the front seat and Jack clambered into the back of that little Volkswagen Bug, and he was perfectly cool with that, you know. But I spent the weekend with Jack and Roz Kirby. Anyway, the point is, I got to meet so many people there, and it was really a result of the Telegraph Wire that I met the people at Marvel who, well, I met Christopher Claremont and Frank Miller, and they were the two who recommended me for the job at Marvel that I was hired for in January 1985, and that was as assistant to Ann Nesenti. Annie was Christopher's editor on X-Men at that point, and she needed an assistant. Chris thought I would be great for the job, and so that's, you know, it was the networking that happened at Comics and Comics, and the friends that I made there that led to the job offer at Marvel. You know, comics was still so small in those days, Mike. You could meet everyone.
Yeah, it was a very tightly knit community.
Yeah,
Imagine.
I mean, San Diego, the first San Diego con I ever went to in 1982, there were 4,000 people. That's it, 4,000. So anyone working the floor, you saw in the bar that night. You know,
yeah,
it was just. I met Frank Miller walking the streets of Berkeley. He was doing a signing at the competition store the next day, and I saw a fellow walk out of there, tall, long overcoat. Nobody wore an overcoat in Berkeley. It was sunny and warm, you know. Dark glasses, smoking a cigarette. And I walked up to him and said, "Are you Frank Miller?" I just, for whatever reason, I thought, man, that's got to be him. He was an obvious New Yorker, you know, in sunny Berkeley, California. And yeah, it was Frank. And he knew, when I told him who I was, he knew who I was, because I'd been writing letters to Daredevil that had been getting published. So it was a really exciting 3 years working the Berkeley Comics and Comics, and doing the magazine, the fanzine. And as you say, I began writing. I did some interviews for the Comics Journal, also for Comics Buyer's Guide. So that kind of, I met so many people, and that those friendships are still, I mean, they still exist, you know. So
this amazing cauldron of creativity, and just the names that you've had the chance to not only meet but work with is really amazing. And I want to get into that, especially your work at Comico and Dark Horse. Um, but first, without belaboring the point on the Marvel experience, what were your expectations going into that job? What did you think it was going to be, and then how did it, I guess, either disappoint you or become different than what you were thinking it was going to be?
Yeah, I was just really out of my element, you know. First, I was a comic book fan, and uh, and I got the sense in the Marvel offices that fans were disparaged to some extent.
Hmm.
There were a few fans who had gotten jobs there, um, but I was 29 at that point, um, uh, uh, a West Coast hippie, and a comic book fan, and suddenly I found myself in uh, a Midtown Manhattan corporate environment, and that's what it was. It uh, I didn't get, maybe if I had been working for Archie Goodwin in the epic line of creator-owned books, um, things might have been different. Um, and not to say anything against Annie Nocenti, she was fantastic. She was kind. Um, she was receptive. She taught me a lot. Um, but I was not comfortable there. I was not comfortable at Marvel, and I had been used to working for small companies, and suddenly I was up and out the door at 6:30 in the morning and commuting into Manhattan, um, and yeah, that just wasn't for me. I just was so uncomfortable. And day 5, anyone hired into editorial had to had it was had to have their, what they called their indoctrination lecture, and it was Jim Shooter was then editor-in-chief at Marvel, and it was, you were sort of trotted in and sat down with Shooter, and he was going to tell you the way things were at Marvel and the way editors were at Marvel, and you know, life, the universe, and everything according to Jim Shooter. So that was scheduled for day 5, and I was terrified. And so, and I just, the pie in the sky that I had expected, I really wasn't finding there. And so that morning I called in to Annie and said, I can't do this. It's not for me. I'm sorry, I quit. Which I have to say, like all these years later, having had assistants bail on me, or having hired assistants who, for one reason or another, have not worked out, it's it's a tough thing, and personnel was something I hated throughout my career as an editor, and hiring and firing. Um, it was just awful, and something that I'm not cut out for. And I feel, at the time, I didn't realize what a bad position I was putting Annie into. And yeah, now, of course, I realize that in spades, having been on that end of things
Hmm.
myself. Um, but I was a fish out of water there, and and just out of my element.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Enough said, as Stan would put it. Well, let's turn to happier times, which is your first significant role, and then eventually, I think, editor-in-chief, which is of Comico. Um, you know, after that experience with Marvel, how did your experience at Comico sort of give you your kind of editorial confidence?
Um, well, I learned a lot at Marvel, and one thing I learned in particular that served me well was scheduling and production schedules, how to make them, how to ensure that your books will be on time. Um, at Marvel, Virginia Romita, wife of the late John Romita, was their production manager, and she made the book schedules, and that was a really valuable lesson that I took with me to Comico, and I was first hired there as editorial coordinator, and that was the purpose. That was my job, was to make schedules for all the books, to get everyone on schedule, because that company was not able to get a book out on time ever, until I put all the books on schedules, and then started calling up creators. All the people that you're working with, you just call them up every week, and this is before email, of course, before the internet. So the phone was our tool, our best work tool ever. So that was the first thing that I took to Comico, was getting the books on track. And they had just signed the license, the Macross license, and they had to juggle 3 different titles under the Robotech family name, I guess. And the books were coming out every 2 weeks. So there would be Macross 1 week, something Generation 2 weeks later, and I'm forgetting the 3rd title 2 weeks after that. But every 2 weeks, one of the 3 books came out. And that would have been impossible to do without schedules and without constant phone calls to all the creatives involved to make sure that things were on track.
Now,
Did I answer that question?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think you were there. You can correct me, for 5 years, or at least a significant amount of time. Do you feel that you found if there even is such a thing, your editorial voice or style there? And what is that, or what would you consider that?
Gosh, that's a good question. And I'm not entirely sure of the answer. You know, I was alone in a den full of boys, basically. And I had gotten the job, I should mention, riding the very generous coattails of my ex-husband, Bob Schreck, who had been hired before me there, as their marketing guy. And Bob was also actively involved in acquisitions, in licensing particularly. so and editorially, I was pretty much alone there for quite a while. It's easy to be editor-in-chief when you're the only editor there.
That's
um,
true.
but I was, I sort of started by overseeing all the titles, and having had publishing experience on my fanzine on the Telegraph Wire, as well as just those 4 days at Marvel to see kind of how things went in the creation of comics from start to finish. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just felt like I knew what I was doing there, and the the owners, the quote unquote publishers of the company, pretty clearly did not. They had not worked in publishing jobs anywhere. They had brought Bob in to help them get more professional. But really, once Bob and I were both working there together, that's when their books started coming out on time. That's when their licenses started selling. And they just sort of, they took a real step up from what they had been, which was basically, some black and white comics that came out very randomly and that weren't very good, with the exception of Matt Wagner's work. The publishers had, they had begun Comico as a way of publishing their own work. It was a self-publishing enterprise when it started, and it needed to evolve beyond that because it wasn't making any money. Those guys weren't making any money. They didn't really know what they were doing, and I don't think people out in the world took them very seriously, but they took Bob seriously. Bob had run creation conventions for years, and so he also was pretty heavily networked. Creation used to put on conventions, comics conventions, every weekend in a different city in the country. So one weekend Bob would be in LA, the next weekend he'd be in Pittsburgh, the next weekend he'd be in New Jersey somewhere, and each show had different guests and different different artists in their artist alley. So Bob really knew everyone, and he was and is a real social creature, much more than I am. So between the two of us, that was a real partnership. Me and Bobby working together. We took what was basically a self-publishing company and made it something real. And editorial style, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that is. I must be too close to that to be able to answer that question.
And maybe it's something that you develop later, or maybe it's something that people could tell you about than you can tell about yourself.
I
Whether
think
you're
I think that's probably true. That strikes me as, that's like the the legacy question, when people ask me, what do I think my legacy is? And it's like, well, that's not for me to say, really. Yeah, and I'm not sure. The only thing I can say about editorial style, I guess, is, I because of the era in which I first came into comics, as I said earlier, it was a very political time, and the onus was on the creator, because the publishers, Marvel and DC largely, but comics publishing made money on the backs of the talent for decades, in some really unjust and unjustifiable ways. One of the reasons that comics are so expensive now is because creators have a better deal now than they did 40 years ago, So if I had any style at all, it was to recognize that the creator, ultimately, it was the creators who paid my salary. And sure, Mike Richardson signed those checks every 2 weeks at Dark Horse, signed those paychecks every 2 weeks. But without the creators, there would be no paychecks for him to sign. And so the notion that the creator came first was always, that was no question with me. So yeah, and that's really pretty different from the Marvel and DC approach. I'd never heard this myself, but apparently editors screaming on the phone at their creators was a standard, method of operation, I guess. That, for me, I tried to become friends with the people I worked with. Sometimes that was really easy. Matt became my best friend before he became part of my family. But even, the people that I didn't become friends with, professional colleagues, I always maintained a level of respect that's just, it's a line that you just don't cross. You can't cross. Your job exists because they make it possible. So that's, yeah. And I guess that's not style so much as just editorial philosophy.
That's fine. It sort of ties back to our earlier philosophy question. I have a feeling we're probably headed for a two-parter here.
It's our time up.
Because I do want to kind of really delve into Dark Horse, but if you're willing to come back, that would be great, and have a little bit more time. But sort of a similar question, or a question off of that, and something you mentioned earlier, is that you've obviously dealt with, or not dealt with, but you've edited a lot of male creators, because predominantly, at least at that point, the industry was predominantly male, and as well as the editorial staff, but also those that were quite successful, at least later on in your Dark Horse years, that may have presented, let's say, strong egos. Uh, what was your approach to, I guess, managing these personalities and these creators that, again, are they may have a high esteem of them their own selves and very strong opinions and directions, and of course, are you are trying to lead to the best possible product. How did you sort of manage that?
Do you have someone in mind? I mean, do you want to name names here?
No,
Uh,
I don't really actually. I mean, people can look up your bibliography and who you work with, but there's more than one. I mean, there are some strong creators and personalities there, and so you seem to have done a great service in helping to produce these books without them getting in their own way.
I think the thing, I think the thing is, and this is something that's also really important to keep in mind as an editor. It takes ego to do what creatives do. It takes ego to put your stuff down on the page like that, because you're putting yourself down on the page. Um, and you have to have a healthy ego to do that. So when you bear that in mind, first of all, and realize that, yes, of course, this guy is going to have an ego. Look at what he's done. Why wouldn't he have an ego? He's got a lot to be proud of. Um, by the same token, there's politeness as well. Um, I really, I can't say that I've never had trouble with anyone. Uh, that wouldn't be true. Um, I'll say it right here, since I confessed it on Facebook a few days ago. Um, Dan Barry, the late great Dan Barry, made me cry every single day uh, of the time I worked with him. He was Dark Horse had just gotten their first Lucasfilm license, which was Indiana Jones, and the lead into Star Wars. Mike Richardson, Dark Horse publisher, my boss, was angling to get that Star Wars license. It was at Marvel still, and he really wanted it. And he, as with so many other things, he succeeded. He eventually succeeded, but he started by getting Indiana Jones and showing Lucas that he could, that this little company in a town in Oregon that you've never heard of, a suburb of Portland, could do the job and could do it better than Marvel. And so I was given that first Indiana Jones series to edit, and it was dictated to me who the artist would be, Dan Barry. I I knew nothing about newspaper comics at the time. It would take until I was in my 50s really to start learning about the old newspaper strips, and how magnificent they are. Anyway, so Dan Barry, I guess, did work on Flash Gordon. That is much revered among newspaper comic strip fans. I did not know his work, but I was told that he was a big deal, and and that I was to, play ball very nicely with him. So I was certainly extremely polite, but it was a licensed comic, and I had experience with that. And with licensed comics, at the end of the day, it's the licensor who calls the shots, you know. So, and Dan Barry did not like that very much. Speaking of egos, uh, he he felt that he shouldn't have to kowtow to Lucasfilm, and I think he also wasn't very happy that a woman half his age was, you know, was that person caught between a rock and a hard place, between Dan Barry on the one hand and Lucasfilm on the other. So yeah, it was tough. How did I deal with that immense ego, with that guy screaming at me on the phone? Because he wanted to draw what he wanted to draw, and he didn't like the story that he was given, that had been written by someone based on a game, on an Indiana Jones computer game, and adapted from that game. And that was the deal that we had, and Dan just didn't like it. He'd sign the contract, but then he didn't want to do what he had agreed to do. So that was a problem. How did I deal with it? Eventually Dan did the job, but every day on the phone, he got out his frustration by yelling at me. And every day when I got off the phone, I got up and I left the building, and I walked around the block and had a little cry, and then came back to my desk and back to work. Yeah, the creator is sacrosanct, really. And even if he's a rude son of a bitch like Dan Barry was, it's just not your place as an editor or as a human being to treat anyone that way. He shouldn't have treated me the way he did, but he felt entitled to do so given his long and stellar career. That didn't give me license to treat him in kind.
Yeah.
So,
well,
so yeah, what do you do when there's big ego that you have to deal with? Well, you deal with it, you remind yourself constantly that they have a right to that ego. They have a need for that ego, because without it, they're never going to do that fantastic work, because it takes that ego to put all of yourself on the page like that. And at the end of the day, what you're looking for is, you're looking for the book. You're looking to make the best book you possibly can. You're looking to get the best work out of everyone on the team that you can. And you are sort of insignificant compared to all the talent that you're working with. So, you need to keep your own. If you're the publisher or representative of the publisher, as editors are, you need to keep your own ego in check. And I think that's where problems arise. Let the creatives have their ego. It's important. Yours yeah, you sit on it.
Well, I think that somewhat answers kind of your editorial style, which is sort of the invisible hand and
Mm,
the, maybe the glue that brings these elements together, even if there are, some elements that are a little rougher to fit into place than others. So, but and I'm sure that's also probably I would hope the minority of experiences you have.
yeah, yes, absolutely. And then less than 10 years later, I find myself working with the late, great, amazing Will Eisner. Um, you know, in many ways, the father of comics, or as Paul Levitz calls him, the champion of comics. Um, and there's a case where I was completely freaked out. Not only were we not given enough time to do this book, um, based on normal lead times at that point in the industry, but it was Will Eisner, and and Will, on the other hand, had no ego. He was charming. I mean, he was at that point 80 something.
Hmm.
Um, and and he was he was just so wonderful to work with. Uh, I, when the work came in, it turns out we were just starting to go to digital scanning at that point, and the work needed some cleanup. He'd done it. I'm talking about a book called Last Day in Vietnam, um, which is 6 stories that reflect Will's own wartime experiences, either in World War II or in Vietnam when he was sent over as a reporter by the PS to do something for that PS Army magazine thing that he worked on for decades. Um, anyway, he did the work on this textured board. It was pebbly, and the scanner was having a really hard time with that, and so there was a lot of cleanup work to be done. There were some spelling and punctuation issues, and I did my usual thing. I got a printout of the scans and just page by page mark them up. And I was a pretty thorough editor. In fact, that was my boss's main complaint about my work. I was too thorough, meaning I took too long to do stuff. Um, uh, anyway, by the time I got through this graphic novel, or this collection of short stories that Will had done, however many pages it was, 80 something, um, the printout was marked up everywhere in red. And I thought, oh my God, how can I send this to Will Eisner? It's impossible. I mean, the idea would be I'd send it to Will, he would make the corrections, and at that point, we were not yet making corrections digitally, so corrections were still getting done on the board. So, yeah, I was really nervous about that, and when I finally just sucked it up and sent my corrections to Will, he called me and the first thing he said was, Diana, I'm so embarrassed. I'm so sorry. So from Will Eisner, you know. Anyway, yeah. He who could have had all the ego in the world had none.
And welcome back, folks. What did you think? I really enjoyed talking to Diana. We barely scratched the surface of Dark Horse, but we got into so much of her early life. But we need to have her back for a part two. There's so much more to explore within her career, and she's a great person to talk to. But that'll do it for this episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for rating, reviewing, and subscribing, and doing all those things that support this podcast. We really appreciate it. We can't wait to bring you more interviews. And so we'll see you next issue.